Okay, so I'm going to talk in English about the relationship between human nature and political philosophy. It might seem like these are two very different subjects that are unrelated. Scientists study human nature, philosophers, political scientists study philosophy or study governments. And the idea here, the reason for putting these two things together, human nature and political philosophy, is that for the last 2,500 years, people have thought particular things about what we're like, what human nature is like, and they've derived political conclusions from that. They've organized society around those thoughts. So, I'm going to just really quickly review a few of these people: Plato, Aristotle, Hobbes, Marx. I think you've all heard of them. Plato thought that there are natural hierarchies, that there are, in effect, better and worse people. There are superior and inferior people. And the job of the state is to organize us in such a way that the superior guided the choices of the inferior. He even had a famous parable called the myth of the metals being gold, silver, and bronze. And the idea is a harmonious society is not one of equality, but one in which the gold rule over the silver and the silver guide the bronze. Aristotle thought not only are we a hierarchical species, man is a political animal, as he said, and he meant that we thrive in groups and in hierarchical groups. He thought slavery was perfectly natural. In fact, slavery benefited the slave much more than it benefited the master. Why? Because the slave needed to be guided. So it's no sort of coincidence that they defended a natural aristocracy. This isn't a crazy idea. If you have this view of human nature, aristocracy naturally follows. Hobbes, famously, the first modern liberal, thought we're born free and equal. And he meant that in a natural sense. We're born without any real hierarchy. There's no God sort of saying, you're on top, you're on the bottom. We're naturally free and equal. So, of course, in his view, the liberal view of the state, the job of the state is not to promote a hierarchy, but to protect the interest of the individual. The idea of rights really comes from Hobbes. And then Marx has this idea that there's no nature at all. I think this is a crazy idea, but if you have this idea, as Marx did, then the intellectuals are going to matter a lot. The ideas that the professors, that the journalists, and so on develop are going to naturally infiltrate the minds of the common people, and that's going to determine what they're like. So Marx said, for example, that the essence of man is the totality of social relations. It's not a set of biological predispositions. Okay, so what do modern social scientists think about human nature? Well, the answer is they're a lot closer to Marx than they are to Plato or Aristotle. And I don't mean that as a good or bad thing, but it is true. So many social scientists embrace this Marxist view that we're the totality of social forces. And I'll give you an example. In American and British universities, there was a survey done a couple of years ago. And the average sociologist actually thinks that biology has nothing to say about what kind of creature we are. Only 13% of sociologists think that evolutionary biology helps explain human nature, and only 1/3 believe that biology is the main reason men are more aggressive than women. In other words, 2/3 of sociologists think that the only reason men are more aggressive or violent than women is because they're taught that. It's just sociology all the way down. I actually think that most ordinary people without college degrees are much closer to the truth on this matter than the average sociologist with a PhD in the United States or England. Nevertheless, these are influential people. If you are a journalist, if you're a teacher, you have to go through the university system, and you certainly get indoctrinated into these kinds of views. What do natural scientists, biologists, and other scientists think about human nature? Here we get a very different picture of what sociologists believe. So these are 3 very recent books, one from 2018, 2020, and 2017 here. And let me just give you 3 summary bullet points from these books. So the first, Blueprint, this is from a behavioral geneticist who studies twins raised in the same household and raised apart. And this is a good way of teasing apart nature and nurture. What parts of our personality, our physicality is a product of nature versus nurture. What does Robert Plomin find after doing this research for 50 years and collating thousands of papers? Well, all psychological traits are highly genetically heritable. For example, intelligence by adulthood is about 80% heritable. Personality traits are about 50% heritable, and personality traits influence our moral and political views. They influence the way that we vote, the way that we think, and so on, in very specific ways. The second book by David Buss, this is an evolutionary psychology book, and he tests the idea and finds that traits like aggression, sexual jealousy, status seeking, these are human universals. They're biological predispositions. They're not produced by socialism or capitalism, by hierarchical societies or non-hierarchical societies. Those societies can drive these dispositions in different ways, but they're actually natural biological predispositions. And third, this is from Daniel Kahneman's book, Nobel Prize winner in behavioral economics. Well, it turns out economists sort of overestimated the extent to which we're rational in the sense of consciously calculating the way that we act. Instead, it looks like the best evidence is we're driven by heuristics, biases, and narratives. This is why people tend to think in religious terms. All societies have religion. They tend to think in metaphorical terms. They tend to think about case studies. What did my friend say or do? What's going on in my neighborhood? They're not very good at reasoning statistically. And even when you show them statistics, they often don't want to change their mind, especially about political matters. Okay, why does all this matter? So this is just a survey. I'm kind of making fun of sociologists. I'm not really making fun of natural scientists, but I'm pointing out a discrepancy here and then mentioning the extent to which ancient thinkers had a deep influence on how political societies are run. Let's put these ideas together. John Maynard Keynes, another Nobel Prize-winning economist. You guys probably know him if you've studied economics anyway, the Keynes-Hayek debate. He also influenced, well, I think, what happened after World War I. He opposed penalizing Germany with reparations. He said this will definitely lead to a second world war, and he was right. But in this quotation, what he says is practical men who believe themselves exempt from intellectual influence are usually just the slaves of some defunct economist. Really, he meant not just economist, the slave of some thinker who they probably don't even know the name of. We absorb these ideas in universities. Why? Because your professors have read various people. They've been convinced by Marx or Plato or Hobbes or whoever. And these ideas indirectly filter down into the population. You're just the slave of some defunct economist if you think, I'm just a practical person, right? I don't need to listen to these guys. Well, I think he's actually right. He's not right about everything, but I think he's right about this. And let me just give you two quick examples. The first is Mao Zedong of China, the leader of the Great Leap Forward in China in the 1950s. Mao credited Marx and Lenin as his teachers. No surprise there. He was a communist. And he said a good communist should look upon the revolution as his very life. He should be more concerned about the party and the masses than any private person. In other words, there are no individual interests, only collective interests. Margaret Thatcher, just a few years later in a very different country, said quite the opposite. Margaret Thatcher identified with the liberal tradition. She learned from Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and ultimately Hobbes. What did she say? Famously, there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals and there are families. In other words, there are no collective interests, there are only individual interests, and everything she did, every law she passed, reflected that vision. Okay, what happens when we get human nature wrong? I think, again, going back to the 20th century, we have some good examples. Most people don't get human nature this wrong, but some people did. Utopian socialists in the 20th century have a body count that's much higher than any one dictator in World War II. So when we look at, for example, the collectivization of private property in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, within 2 years, 5 million people starved to death. All you had to do is do one simple thing: abolish private property, collectivize the farms. You create what economists call a tragedy of the commons. What is that? It's when you pay the full costs of work, but the benefits are socialized, right? So what do people do? They work less, they work in less efficient ways. You don't have a price system that allocates property efficiently, and you get a pile of bodies. This is recapitulated in the 1950s during the Great Leap Forward. Once again, Mao Zedong. And in this case, when private property was abolished, the estimate is that between 15 and 50 million people starved to death within 4 years. All you have to do is abolish private property, and you get mass starvation. Finally, in Cambodia, a few years later, another communist revolution. And what do we get? Well, in a period of 3 years, 1/4 of the population starves to death or is murdered because the state is trying to get them to act in ways that they're simply not wired to act in. If you're not producing enough, it's because you are the problem. You've been indoctrinated by capitalism or some other social force. What I'm going to do is get you to work harder by abolishing property and by pointing a gun to your head. And if you don't do it, you're out. 1/4 of the population killed in less than a decade. Think about that. Okay, well, that is pretty grim, but I want to draw a few more optimistic conclusions, 2 of which are going to be obvious, and 1 I think is going to be a big surprise. So the surprise is last, of course. The first is that I think it's fairly obvious from these examples we should take account of human nature. When we're designing political institutions, we should make those institutions incentive compatible, as economists say. And we should take account of human nature when we are trying to figure out what we can reasonably expect of citizens. People have different values, they have different motivations, and so we need to understand that when we're designing policies and trying to get them to act in particular ways. The image here is of Procrustes, the Greek myth. He was the son of Poseidon. What did Procrustes do? When he tortured his victims, he'd put them on a bed, and if they were too short, he'd stretch them out until their arms and legs broke off. If they were too tall, he would just cut off the arms and legs, and they'd bleed out. This is a good metaphor for what happens when a state fails to take account of human nature and when the state blames the citizens rather than its own policies for a collective result that harms the citizens. This is a good metaphor, then, for what happens when government policies fail to align with human nature. A few more specific conclusions that we can learn from modern economics, although I think some of the American founders understood these ideas, and even Plato did. Namely, that when we want to get people to behave well, we need to incentivize that. People are altruistic. There's no doubt about that. They're not only egoistic. Even Adam Smith, the founder of capitalism, his first book was on ethics, and he thought it was remarkable just how generous people are, much more generous than other animals in the animal kingdom. We behave generously toward non-kin, toward people outside of our family. That's quite remarkable, but our generosity isn't infinite. We need to incentivize good behavior. So for example, a simple case is if you want less pollution, what do? You probably shouldn't trust a politician to pick out which company should produce energy and which one shouldn't. Normally, a politician will reward friends and punish enemies. They'll act inefficiently. You want to tax pollution and then let the market decide which is the most efficient way of producing energy at the lowest cost, which also produces less pollution. Secondly, federalism. And these are really obvious lessons, I guess, but wait until we get to the 3rd slide. Federalism is a really good solution to avoiding civil war. Different groups within all countries have different interests. Here in Ecuador, we've got different indigenous groups. You've got city dwellers, farmers, people living in the coast. The worst possible thing is to take every problem and have Quito's solution apply to Guayaquil, to every possible city. Instead, what you want is some level of devolution of power so that people feel like they're in control of their own communities. This is why in the United States we have 50 separate states and, in principle at least, not a strong federal government. That's not true anymore. It keeps growing in size and power every year. But federalism evolved for a specific reason, understanding that there were thousands of years of religious and ethnic wars, and that you could tamp those down by giving local people a little more power to solve their own problems. Finally, scale matters. So back to the original example of communism. Communism is a great idea within the family. Capitalism is a horrible idea within your family. If for Christmas, for Navidad, you propose giving gifts to the person who's most effective, who makes the most money who is the most productive, and you punish the people who are least productive. So grandmother gets, as we say in the United States, gets a lump of coal in her stocking. And the person who's 35 years old and has a doctorate and makes the most money, we're going to give them the most presents. That's not how a family works. That's the quickest way to dissolve your family. Communism in the family is actually a pretty good idea for the most part. Incentives work, it's true, but the idea here isn't to efficiently allocate resources. Even on a slightly larger scale, socialism can work, or some versions of communism. If you take an example like the Israeli kibbutzim, these are small communes in Israel. They're typically religious, although not all of them are. And they have maybe 500, 1,000 people. Why does communism work here? Well, it's pretty obvious. You've got a small number of people. They have common interests. They voluntarily entered the commune. Stalin didn't take them and capture their property. They are allowed to leave the commune. It's a small enough number that you can actually monitor one another, and if someone is a free rider, you can punish them and kick them out. So socialism can actually work at a really small scale. Capitalism doesn't work at a very small scale very well. A camping trip, a family get-together. And so one obvious lesson here isn't that communism is bad, capitalism is good, or vice versa. It's that scale really matters, along with some of these other lessons, incentives, federalism, and so on. Here's the really radical conclusion, though. For the first time in human history, I think, we have the following choice. We can either change our political institutions to fit our nature, or we can change our nature to fit our political ambitions. And some of you have probably heard of these new technologies. They're coming online quickly. One that I have in mind is CRISPR-Cas9. That is an acronym that will give you a headache if I tell you what it is, but why not? Clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. Okay, so what that means is more or less bacteria have been invaded for millions of years, billions of years by viruses. And what they found is a way in which they can sequence viruses and then make very precise cuts to those viruses. This technique has only been understood for a few decades. Emmanuel Charpentier in France and Jennifer Doudna in Berkeley in California first discovered and won the Nobel Prize for discovering how this works. And then they started using this and altering the genome of organisms. And although this is not legal yet, it will be legal soon in some countries. And even if it's made illegal in other countries, it will be used. Demand for this will be high. And this is going to be a way of fundamentally rewriting the human genome. Before this is available, what is available right now, and it is happening right now, is embryo selection using certain things called polygenic scores. The idea is women who use IVF, in vitro fertilization, get a range of embryos. They can now test these embryos not just for single gene disorders like Huntington's disease. They can test them for physical and mental traits and select the embryo that is optimal among the set of traits that they most want. Again, whether this creeps you out, whether this is exciting, whether this is horrifying, it will happen. You can imagine that as soon as one country makes it illegal, others will make it legal. There will be a massive market for this. And this is possible right now. It's happening right now. It's going to happen for mental traits very, very soon. This is an example of a situation in which, for the first time, we can actually take human evolution into our own hands. It will be taken into our own hands, like it or not. And in this sense, again, there are going to be very different kinds of people born in the future, and they're going to face a choice: fitting their institutions to match their nature, or changing their nature to match their political ambitions or institutions. Again, whatever you think about this possibility, I think it's exciting, I think it's fascinating. I don't know where it's going to go, but I do think that everybody should get a better understanding of human nature, and we'd all be better off if the elites that propagate information, the journalists, the professors, the people around us, had a better sense of what our nature is like and what tools are going to quickly be available to alter that nature. Thank you.